The Iron Eagle of Vinland. Chapter 1. The Pact of Iron and Cedar. The year was 1002 when Leif Erikson, once known merely as Leif the Lucky, stood at the prow of his flagship and watched the last gray memories of Greenland vanish behind a veil of sea mist. He did not sail west out of curiosity this time. He sailed because there was nothing left behind him worth returning to. The Jarls of Norway were at each other's throats. Christianity was consuming the old ways like fire through dry timber, and the winters of Greenland had grown so savage that 3 settlements had already collapsed into starvation and silence. Leif had watched his father Eric the Red build a kingdom from nothing on a frozen rock, and he had learned one lesson above all others. When the land turns against you, you find new land. He had visited the western shores before. He had seen the forests that stretched beyond the horizon, the rivers fat with silver fish, the soil so dark and rich it looked like ground charcoal. He had called it Vinland and thought little more of it, but now, standing at the head of a fleet of 300 long ships carrying nearly 4,000 souls, warriors, yes, but also blacksmiths, weavers, farmers, healers, children, and livestock, he saw it differently. This was not an expedition. This was an exodus. The crossing was brutal. 2 ships were lost to a storm off the coast of what would one day be called Newfoundland. A third ran aground on a reef and had to be abandoned. Its cargo redistributed among the remaining fleet. Disease moved through the lower decks like a whisper, taking the old and the very young with quiet efficiency. But Leif drove them south, always south, following the coastline with the instinct of a man who had spent his entire life reading the sea. He had heard stories from the handful of Skraelings he had encountered on his first voyage, stories told through gesture and rough trade sign, of warmer lands further down the coast, of rivers wide enough to lose a longship in, of forests so vast that a man could walk for a month without seeing the same tree twice. They found the Chesapeake in early autumn, when the trees along the shore had turned to fire and gold. Leif stood at the prow and felt something shift in his chest. Not the restless hunger that had driven him across the ocean, but something quieter and more dangerous. Recognition. This was the place. He could feel it in the weight of the air, in the smell of the soil carried on the wind, in the way the bay opened before them like a hand offering a gift. They were not alone. Within 2 days of anchoring, figures appeared on the tree line. Not 1 or 2 scouts, but dozens, men and women of the Haudenosaunee and Algonquian nations, watching the strange wooden beasts with their striped sails from the safety of the forest edge. Leif had dealt with the Skraelings before. He knew that his men's first instinct would be to reach for iron, and he knew that instinct would doom them all. 4,000 people could not fight a continent. They could only negotiate with it. He made a decision that his warriors thought was madness. He ordered every weapon sheathed and every shield stowed below deck. Then he climbed into a small rowing boat alone, carrying nothing but a short iron knife, a loaf of bread, and a piece of worked steel. A small, perfectly forged buckle, smooth and gleaming, unlike anything that could be produced from bone or stone. He rowed to shore and sat down on the sand and waited. It took the better part of a day, but they came. The man who emerged first from the tree line was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a cloak of beaver fur and a headdress of eagle feathers that marked him as a man of considerable standing. His name, Leif would later learn, was Ianwahata, a war chief of the Haudenosaunee Confederation, a man whose reputation for both ferocity and wisdom had spread across the eastern woodlands. He studied Leif with dark, calculating eyes, then looked at the iron buckle sitting in the sand between them. He picked it up, turned it over in his fingers, tapped it against his thumbnail, and listened to the ring of it. Then he looked at Leif and said something in a language Leif could not understand, but whose tone was unmistakable. He was asking, how? That single question was the foundation upon which everything was built. The negotiations took weeks, conducted through a painstaking process of gesture, demonstration, and the gradual construction of a shared pidgin language that blended Old Norse with Algonquian roots. Leif's blacksmith, a barrel-chested man named Gunnar Ironhand, became the most important diplomat in the history of the Western world without ever knowing it. He set up his forge on the beach and worked iron in full view of the gathered Haudenosaunee, letting them watch every step of the process. He forged axe heads and knife blades and handed them out freely. He showed them how to work the bellows, how to read the color of the metal in the fire, how to quench and temper. He gave away the most valuable secret his civilization possessed, and he did it with the cheerful generosity of a man who simply loved his craft. In return, Ianwada's people opened the land. They showed the Norse the hidden river routes that connected the bay to the interior, the caches of wild grain that could be cultivated, the medicinal plants that would save dozens of lives through the first winter. They provided labor and knowledge, and, most critically, they provided legitimacy. When other nations came to investigate the strange, pale settlers on the bay, they found them already under the protection of the Haudenosaunee. The message was clear. These newcomers were not invaders. They were guests who had earned their welcome. The first winter was still hard. 11 people died of cold, 7 more of illness, but the settlement held. By spring, the long houses and the mead halls were rising side by side, their architectural languages beginning to blend into something new. Wide, low structures of timber and stone with carved Norse dragons coiling around Haudenosaunee clan symbols above the doorways. Children who had been born on the ships were already learning 2 languages simultaneously, their young minds building bridges between worlds that had never known each other existed. Leif named the settlement Raffenborg, Raven's Fortress. He drove his iron broadsword into the soil at its center. Hilt first, as both a symbol of peace and a declaration of permanence. He was not a visitor. He was not an explorer. He was a king planting roots in new earth, and those roots would grow deeper and wider than any tree in the vast forests that surrounded him. By the time Leif Erikson died in 120, the Vinlandic Union stretched from the northern shores of the bay to the foothills of the great mountain spine to the west. His son Harald took the throne of a kingdom that was already something unprecedented in human history, a civilization that was neither Norse nor Native American, but a living fusion of both, forged in iron and cedar, bound by trade and blood, and the shared memory of survival. And from the south, carried on the lips of traders who had traveled further than any Norseman had yet dared to go, came rumors of stone cities in the jungle, of kings who wore gold-like armor, of astronomers who had mapped the stars with a precision that made the Norse navigators weep with envy. Harald listened to those rumors and felt the same thing his father had felt, standing at the prow of his ship, watching the Chesapeake open before him, recognition. There was more to find. There was always more to find. The Union would not stay small for long. Chapter 2. The Admiral's Cage. By the late 15th century, the Vinlandic Union had grown into a continental power. The Norse longhouses of the north had fused with the Haudenosaunee palisade fortresses, and the great agricultural belts of the Powhatan and Susquehannock fed a population larger than any Leif could have imagined. Trade caravans moved along paths carved through the forests and rivers, canoes and longships sharing the same waters, their crews speaking a blended tongue of Old Norse and Algonquian rhythm. And further south, emissaries had returned from the stone cities of the Maya and the empire of the Mexica, bearing gifts and proposals. The seeds of a greater alliance had been planted in the soil of 2 continents. The Union prospered in silence. No word went east across the sea. No ship returned to Europe. It was as though the Atlantic itself were a curtain drawn shut by the gods. For centuries, the Eastern world wondered why the ocean swallowed their bravest explorers. And then, in 1492, a new sailor challenged the silence. The fleet that approached the Caribbean coast was small, 3 Spanish caravels, battered by storms but still flying the banner of Castile. They moved cautiously toward land, their masts creaking in the wind. The sailors whispered half-mad stories about sea monsters and endless storms. But their captain believed in something else entirely. Christopher Columbus expected spices, gold, and a passage to the east. He expected heathens to convert and kingdoms to claim. What he did not expect were the watchers. High on the cliffs overlooking the turquoise waters of the coast, Vinlandic scouts observed the approach. They had been waiting for something like this, waiting for generations. Smoke signals flashed from hill to hill, and within hours, sleek, dark silhouettes cut across the waves. Long ships, yes, but not the rough timber vessels of the old sagas. These were the children of 2 worlds. Norse hulls reinforced with copper plates forged in the great furnaces of Vinland, sails woven from a blend of flax and Mesoamerican cotton, prows carved in the shapes of ravens and feathered serpents. Columbus first heard the oars before he saw the ships, a low, rhythmic thunder that seemed to vibrate through the sea itself. His crews scrambled to their stations, muskets shaking in their hands. The caravels were built for cargo and endurance, not war. Not against a naval force like this. The Vinlandic fleet surrounded the Spanish vessels with the precision of a hunting wolf pack. Columbus's men tried to raise their cannons, but before they could fire a single shot, the enemy boarded them. The warriors who swept across the deck were unlike anything the Spanish had seen. They wore iron breastplates etched with Haudenosaunee clan symbols, feathered capes dyed in Maya indigo, and helmets fashioned in the shape of stylized dragon heads. Their weapons were a terrifying blend of obsidian and steel. Makulia, lined with razor stone shards but tipped with iron blades. The battle lasted minutes. Columbus, dragged before the Vinlandic captain, expected to be executed on the spot. Instead, the warriors studied him with the same curiosity his own king reserved for unusual beasts brought from Africa. They took his maps, his journals, his navigational instruments, objects so ordinary in Europe, but priceless in the West. These they carried with reverence to their ship's cabin, where scholars from the Union waited to examine them. Columbus was brought ashore under heavy guard and escorted along a wide, stone-paved road, unlike anything he had seen outside the Mediterranean. It led to a great hall built from timber and limestone, its roof carved with intertwined serpents and ravens. The city around it sprawled with a complexity he could hardly comprehend. Gardens fed by aqueducts, forges that belched steam, markets where Norse, Algonquian, Maya, and Mexica traders exchanged goods as though this were the center of the world itself. And above the hall flew a banner with 3 symbols. The Raven of the Norse, the great tree of the Haudenosaunee, the sunstone of the Mexica Columbus was brought before the High Council of the Vinlandic Union. They did not kill him. They did something far worse. They learned from him. For weeks the Spanish admiral was interrogated, not tortured, but questioned with a depth that unsettled him more than any pain would have. He revealed Europe's politics, its technologies, its naval routes, its strengths, and its weaknesses. Every chart he had ever drawn was copied. His astrolabe was disassembled. His compass became the foundation of a new lecture in the Union's academy. Columbus realized too later that he had not discovered a new world. He had delivered his own world into the hands of a sleeping giant. When the High Council was satisfied, they reached a unanimous decision. Columbus would not be permitted to return to Europe, nor would any of his crew. The Spanish caravels were burned in a ceremonial fire, their ashes scattered into the sea. To Europe, It would seem as though the Western Ocean had taken yet another explorer into its cold embrace. The Vinlandic Union closed its shores once more, but now they had maps of Europe. They had Spanish steel. They had knowledge of kingdoms across the sea, and most importantly, they knew the old world still believed the West was empty. Soon, they would use that belief against them. The world had split in two the day Leif Erikson landed on Chesapeake's shore. Now, the western half was awakening. Chapter 3: The Triple Crown of the West. By the mid-16th century, the Vinlandic Union had undergone a transformation that would have been unrecognizable to Leif Erikson. The Great Road, a massive artery of stone and packed earth, now stretched from the iron-rich mountains of the north to the humid emerald jungles of the Yucatan. This was the era of the Triple Crown, a formal, unbreakable hegemony between the Norse-descended High Kings of Hraffenborg, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy of the Great Lakes, and the resurgent Maya-Mexica solar states of the south. The capture of Christopher Columbus in 1492 had been the catalyst for a technological explosion. The Union did not merely discover Spanish technology. They dissected it with the cold precision of a master jeweler. In the great academy of Chichen Itza, Norse blacksmiths worked alongside Maya mathematicians and Mexica engineers. They took the captured Spanish caravels apart plank by plank, studying the hull geometry and the rigging. But they did not simply copy the European designs. They improved them. The Maya had already mastered the concept of zero and possessed a celestial calendar, more accurate than anything in Rome. When they applied this mathematical rigor to Norse shipbuilding and Spanish navigational charts, the result was the Sun Stallion class of vessels, ships with the deep, stable hulls of a caravel, but the predatory speed and shallow draft of a longship, steered by obsidian-encrusted magnetic compasses, and tracked by star charts that could pinpoint a vessel's location within a league. However, the Union's greatest leap was not in wood and sail, but in the breadth of the earth. For centuries, the Norse had used peat and wood to smelt iron, but as they pushed into the Appalachian interior, guided by Shawnee and Cherokee scouts, they discovered the stone that burns. Vast exposed seams of high-grade anthracite coal. By 1550, the smoke of massive coking ovens rose over the valley of the Ohio River. The Union's engineers, obsessed with the steam boxes, described and captured European sketches of primitive mining pumps, began to experiment. They combined the Maya mastery of hydraulics with Norse metallurgy to create the first true high-pressure steam engines. These were not used for locomotives yet, but to power massive bellows for furnaces and to drive the saws that processed the endless timber of the West. The Union was undergoing an industrial revolution 200 years before the rest of the world, fueled by a continent's worth of untouched resources and a unified scientific tradition that saw no conflict between spirit and machine. While the technology flourished, the silent watch began. The High Council knew that if one Spanish fleet had come, more would follow. They established the Sky Speaker Network, a chain of signal towers topped with polished silver mirrors and fueled by high-burning phosphorus. Stretching from the tip of Florida to the icy crags of Labrador, any sail spotted on the eastern horizon was signaled across the continent in hours. In 1521, a second Spanish expedition under Juan Ponce de León attempted to land in the south. They did not find a wilderness of Fountain of Youth myths. They found a coastline fortified with star-shaped stone bastions. Before the Spanish could even drop anchor, they were intercepted by a Vinlandic fog fleet, submersible iron-shod barges that moved low in the water, powered by hidden oars and early steam paddles. The Spanish ships were boarded, their crews integrated into the Union's labor force, and their technology added to the ever-growing archives. To the kings of Europe, Charles V, Henry VIII and Suleiman the Magnificent. The Atlantic remained the sea of darkness, a graveyard of vanished dreams. They poured their wealth into wars of religion and dynastic squabbles, oblivious to the fact that across the water a unified superpower was watching them. The Union's trade spies were the most daring part of this silent war. Using the captured Spanish ships, repaired and manned by Norse-descended sailors who could pass for Europeans, the Union began sending small, discreet missions to the ports of Lisbon, Bristol, and Antwerp. These men did not sell gold or spices. They bought books. They bought every treatise on anatomy, every map of the Mediterranean, every pamphlet on the printing press, and every scrap of news about the Protestant Reformation. What's fos? They walked the streets of London and Paris as merchants from the far north, listening to the gossip of taverns and the decrees of parliaments. They saw a Europe that was fractured, superstitious and technologically stagnant compared to the burgeoning might of the West. They returned to the Union with a terrifying report. The Easterners are many, and they are violent. They have forgotten the gods, but they have kept the sword. We must remain hidden until our iron is thick enough to break their world. By 1700, the Union had mastered the telegraph, a primitive but effective system of copper wires powered by chemical batteries, connecting the major citadels of the Triple Crown. They had developed thunder tubes, rifled muskets that used chemically refined saltpeter and lead balls, far more accurate than the clumsy matchlocks of the European armies. The Atlantic was no longer a barrier. It was a one-way mirror. The Vinlandic Union sat in the darkness, watching the flickering lights of Europe, waiting for the moment when the mirror would finally shatter. They were no longer just a kingdom of Vikings or a confederacy of tribes. They were the Iron Eagle, and their wings were tipped with the fire of 1,000 forges. The 18th century arrived, and with it, the first true test of the silence. The British Empire, emboldened by its naval victories and hungry for new lands to replace its dwindling resources, turned its eyes toward the empty West. They sent a fleet not of 3 ships, but of 30. The silence was about to end. Chapter 4. The Thunder of the Eastern Gate. By the dawn of the 18th century, Europe had become a roar of ambition. Empires clawed at one another across continents, fueled by gunpowder, silk, and greed. The British Empire, victorious in recent naval battles and hungry for new wealth, felt the pull of the Western Ocean like a lodestone. For centuries, the Atlantic had swallowed explorers whole, but now the Crown whispered that perhaps the Western lands had never existed at all, and that myth had simply swallowed brave men in storms. New instruments, better hulls, and a rising confidence in British seamanship all told the Admiralty one thing. The so-called Sea of Darkness was no longer beyond their grasp. So in 1723, under a sky streaked with cold winter stars, the HMS Indomitable led a fleet of 30 warships westward. The fleet carried the finest cannons the Empire could build, Marines hardened on European battlefields, and the quiet arrogance of a nation convinced that anything unclaimed was theirs by celestial mandate. They expected storms. They expected obstinacy. What they found ended all illusions. For 5 days after sighting land, the British ships sailed along a coastline of dense, unbroken forest. It looked untouched. Primeval, the admirals whispered that perhaps the fabled lands were truly empty, waiting for the English tongue and English law. But on the 6th day, at dawn, the sun rose over something impossible. A city. It rose from the coastline like a crown of stone and shining metal. Towers of white limestone topped with copper domes, long terraces of carved wood and bright painted architecture, blending Maya precision with Norse geometry, bridges running like woven threads across the river mouth, Steam plumes rose from great chimneys along the waterfront, and enormous docks jutted out into the sea like the jaws of some colossal beast. But what made every man aboard the indomitable fall silent was the sound, a deep, thunderous hum that seemed alive. Machinery, heavy machinery. The Union had not only advanced, it had industrialized. Admiral Hawthorne, a veteran of 20 campaigns, felt the hair rise on his neck. "This is no wild land," he whispered. "This is a kingdom." He never got to finish his thought. A shadow moved across the water, then another, dozens. Through the morning mist, a fleet emerged. Sleek, steel-ribbed ships with low hulls and dark sails woven from a strange, glossy fabric. Their prows were carved into the shapes of ravens, jaguars, and serpents, each painted with vivid pigments that caught the rising sun. Long tubes protruded from their decks, steam-driven artillery pieces unlike anything in Europe. A single horn sounded from the Vinlandic flagship, a deep, resonant note that shook the air. The British fleet readied their cannons. Then, something descended from the sky, a sound like tearing cloth ripped across the clouds. Gas-fed dirigibles, supported by intricately woven Maya fiber and Norse forging, appeared, massive, whale-like airships covered in metal plating. They moved with eerie grace, each bearing the triple crest of the Union. From their undersides hung great iron devices, rotating cylinders that glowed with the heat of internal furnaces. The British froze. Hawthorne managed only one word: "Impossible." A voice boomed from the flagship of the Sky Fleet, amplified by some unseen device. "Strangers of the East, you enter the domain of the Triple Crown." The words, spoken in a rolling blend of Algonquian cadence and Norse consonants, were translated a breath later by a mechanical echo in crisp, accented English. The British officers stared wide-eyed. Europe had barely begun experimenting with such speaking tubes. "You will lower your cannons and furl your sails," the voice continued. "You will prepare to receive envoys of the Vinlandic Union. Resistance will be answered." What followed was not a battle, it was a demonstration. The Vinlandic fleet surrounded the British ships with flawless precision. Steam paddles churned, copper coils hissed, the airships lowered, casting shadows over the ocean like storm clouds. The British cannons were aimed skyward, but the admiral knew, even if they fired every gun in the fleet, they could not bring down these metal leviathans. Power was a language, and the Union spoke it fluently. A delegation arrived aboard the Indomitable, warriors wearing hybrid armor of feathered capes over hammered steel breastplates, their faces marked with ceremonial paint, and their weapons both obsidian-laced and rifled with Norse engineering. They were accompanied by scholars in long woven robes and copper-framed goggles, and by a translator whose accent sounded faintly like London. Though he had never set foot in Europe, Admiral Hawthorne was escorted onto the deck. Above him, the shadow of a skyship blocked the sun. Before him, the delegation waited in absolute, controlled silence. The leader, tall, broad-shouldered with braided blonde hair and a Maya-style jade pendant, stepped forward. "I am Jakan Magnus, son of the High King of the Triple Crown," he said. "Your coming was foretold by your own history. You believe yourselves masters of the sea. You are not." Hawthorne swallowed. "We come in peace, or at least to parley." The man studied him with eyes that held both ancient tradition and modern calculation. "You come seeking conquest," he said, softly but with iron certainty. "But this world is no longer yours to claim." Behind him, the airships thrummed. The fleet glittered with cold metal. The city on the coast, towering, steam-filled, alive, stood as a testament to a civilization that had advanced in silence, untouched by European plague, war, or dogma. A civilization ready for the world. "You will return to your king," Jacon Magnus said, "and you will tell him this. The oceans are no longer empty. The West has awakened, and we decide who may enter." Admiral Hawthorne realized then that history had shifted beneath his feet. The age of discovery was over. The age of contact had begun. Chapter 5: The Horizon of the New Sun. The return of the HMS Indomitable to the Thames in the autumn of 1 Nobbertort 1724 was not the triumphant procession Admiral Hawthorne had envisioned. Instead of hulls heavy with gold and spices, the fleet returned with something far more unsettling, a message of absolute obsolescence. The British Admiralty, and soon the royal courts of Versailles and Madrid, sat in stunned, terrified silence as Hawthorne presented his journals. He spoke of cities that glowed at night with captured lightning, of iron birds that defied the wind, and of a people who spoke a tongue that sounded like the ghosts of Vikings filtered through the wisdom of the jungle. The great reveal shattered the European psyche. For centuries, the West had been a blank canvas for their colonial fantasies. Now, it was a mirror reflecting their own inferiority. The Vinlandic Union did not wait for Europe to process the shock. Within months of Hawthorne's return, the Sky Gate opened. A massive Vinlandic diplomatic fleet, not of wooden caravels, but of steam turbine dreadnoughts with reinforced copper hulls, arrived at the mouth of the Thames. They did not come to invade, they came to dictate. Leading the delegation was High Queen Astrid Joshitel, a woman whose lineage traced back to Leif Erikson and the solar priests of Tenochtitlan. She stepped onto the fog-drenched docks of London, wearing a gown of bioluminescent Maya silk and a mantle of northern wolf fur, flanked by jaguar warriors carrying rifled thunder staves that could pierce a knight's plate from half a mile away. The meeting at St. James's Palace was the funeral of the old world order. King George II, surrounded by his ministers in their powdered wigs and silk breeches, looked like a relic of a bygone era compared to the Vinlandic delegation. The Union scholars brought gifts that felt like sorcery, glass tablets that stored thousands of books, mechanical clocks that never lost a second, and vaccines for the smallpox that had ravaged Europe but had been eradicated in the West centuries ago through combined Norse herbalism and Maya biology. "We have watched you from the shadows of the great forest for 700 years, Astrid Joshitel declared, her voice amplified by a discreet silver collar. "We have seen your crusades, your inquisitions, and your endless wars for scraps of dirt. You have spent your genius on better ways to kill each other. We have spent ours on mastering the world itself. The Atlantic is no longer a barrier, but it is also no longer a playground for your empires. From this day forth, the Vinlandic Union establishes the Pax Occidentalis, the Western Peace." The terms were absolute. The Union demanded an immediate cessation of all European colonial efforts in Africa and Asia, backed by the threat of their orbital trajectory steam cannons. They established trade enclaves in London, Paris, and Lisbon, where European scientists were invited to study, under strict supervision, the principles of earth blood, advanced metallurgy, and star math, Vinlandic calculus. The 18th century, which in another timeline would have been the height of the Enlightenment and the birth of the British Empire, became instead the age of integration. The world tilted on its axis. The center of gravity shifted from the Mediterranean and the North Sea to the Great Bay of the Chesapeake and the stone plazas of the Yucatan. By 1750, the first lightning rail was completed, not in England, but connecting Hraffenborg to the Mesica Highlands, a silver streak of maglev technology powered by the geothermal energy of the volcanic south. The Union's influence seeped into every corner of the globe. European philosophers began to discard their dogmas, replaced by the way of the raven and sun, a philosophy that prioritized the balance of nature with the advancement of the machine. The final scene of this new history took place on the cliffs of Vinland, where the original Pact of Iron and Cedar had been signed centuries before. A monument of obsidian and stainless steel rose toward the clouds, depicting Leif Erikson and Ironwata clasping hands. Below them, a bustling metropolis of glass and greenery hummed with the sound of a civilization that had bypassed the Dark Ages entirely. As a Vinlandic star glider, a prototype for the first lunar mission, ignited its engines and streaked toward the heavens, an elderly Admiral Hawthorne, now a guest scholar in the Union, watched from the balcony of the great library. He looked at the digital chronometer on his wrist, a gift from the High Queen. "They didn't just find a new world," he whispered, to the salt-tinged wind. "They built a better one while we were busy burning ours down." The sun set over the Atlantic, but for the first time in human history, the light did not fade. It simply moved from the dying embers of the east to the radiant, unyielding fire of the west. The Viking king's gamble had not just saved his people, it had accelerated the destiny of the human race by 1,000 years. The stars were no longer gods to be feared, but the next shore to be settled. And the longships, now forged of starlight and vacuum-sealed steel, were ready to sail once more. Thank you for listening. If you like this story, please subscribe for more.